My name is Kennel, and back in 2021, when I was 17 years old, I lived with my parents in a quiet suburban neighborhood. It was one of those places where every house looked identical, with perfectly manicured lawns and streets that seemed to echo tranquility. It was the kind of neighborhood where people waved politely but rarely stopped to chat. Nothing exciting ever happened there. Until that one night. It was a rainy Saturday evening, and my parents had gone to a neighbor's house a few streets away for their weekly chess game. They loved those games, but for me, listening to grown-ups talk about pawns and strategies for hours wasn't exactly thrilling. I told them I'd stay home and planned to spend the night enjoying my solitude with a movie. My choice of the evening? No One Gets Out Alive, an ironically titled horror flick. By 9:30 p.m., I was settled on the couch with a bowl of popcorn, the lights dimmed, and the rain tapping against the windows. It was the perfect ambience for a creepy movie night. The rain's rhythm complemented the unsettling soundtrack, amplifying every jump scare. I was halfway through the movie when an odd noise outside made me pause. It wasn't the wind or thunder. It sounded more deliberate, like a soft scraping against the window. I brushed it off. "Just your imagination, Kennel," I muttered to myself, but the noise persisted, faint yet constant. My pulse quickened. Trying to shake the creeping unease, I refocused on the movie, but at exactly 10 p.m., a loud bang echoed through the house. It wasn't thunder. It was coming from the front door. My heart leapt into my throat, and I froze. Who would knock this late, especially in this weather? Slowly, I crept to the door, careful not to make a sound, and peeked through the peephole. A woman stood on the porch, drenched from the rain, wearing a soaked rain jacket. Her hair clung to her pale face, which was contorted in desperation. "Please," she called out, her voice barely audible over the storm. "I need help. My car broke down, and my phone's dead. Can I use yours to call someone?" The streetlight illuminated her car parked at the curb. Its engine was running, which struck me as strange. If her car was broken down, why was it running? My instinct screamed at me not to open the door, but her soaked, shivering figure made me hesitate. Against better judgment, I unlocked and cracked the door open. "Thank you," she said, stepping closer. But as I moved aside, I saw him. A man in a black hoodie sprinting toward the porch, his face partially obscured, and in his hand, a gun. My blood ran cold. Slamming the door shut, I twisted the deadbolt and locked the chain as the woman's desperate cries turned into frantic pounding. "Let me in." "You don't understand," she screamed, her fists banging against the door. The man reached the porch, his voice booming over the rain. "Open up, now." Panicked, I stumbled back as glass shattered from the back of the house. The kitchen window. My heart pounded as I grabbed a heavy frying pan and darted toward the noise. The man was climbing through the broken window, his hand catching on the jagged glass. Blood smeared the frame as he cursed and tried to pull himself inside. Without thinking, I swung the pan at his hand. He yelped, losing his grip, and fell back into the darkness. Shaking, I ran back to the living room and grabbed my phone. Dialing 911, I barely managed to explain the situation to the operator. "Stay on the line," she instructed. "Officers are on their way." The banging on the front door intensified. "Please, let us in," the woman's voice pleaded, her tone desperate and erratic. Ignoring her, I bolted to the bathroom and locked myself inside, clutching my phone like a lifeline. My fingers trembled as I texted my parents, warning them not to come home. My dad responded instantly, saying he'd called the neighbors for help. Minutes felt like hours. The pounding on the doors suddenly stopped, and an eerie silence enveloped the house. I strained to hear anything. Rain, footsteps, voices. But the stillness was deafening. Then, from above, I heard it. Footsteps. My stomach dropped as I realized they had climbed onto the roof and entered through the attic window. The footsteps creaked closer to the staircase. My breath hitched. Suddenly, sirens wailed in the distance, their red and blue lights illuminating the bathroom window. The footsteps stopped. "Police!" a voice called out, followed by a loud knock on the bathroom door. Still trembling, I unlocked the door and peeked out. Officers moved through the house, their flashlights slicing through the shadows. "It's clear," one of them said, though his tone didn't reassure me. The attic window was wide open, and the intruders were gone. The police took my statement while other officers scoured the neighborhood. My parents arrived shortly after, their faces pale with worry. My dad pulled me into a tight hug. "We're never leaving you alone again," he said, his voice trembling. The woman's car was found abandoned a few streets away. It was stolen. Inside, police discovered duct tape, zip ties, and a knife. The blood on the window frame linked the man to a series of home invasions in the area. Despite the evidence, both the woman and the man vanished without a trace. The thought of them still being out there haunts me to this day. What would have happened if I'd let them in? That question keeps me awake some nights. It's terrifying to think how quickly a quiet suburban night can turn into a scene from a nightmare. What would you have done in Kinnell's situation? Would you have let the woman in, or trusted your instincts? How do you think we can better prepare for situations like this, even in places where nothing ever happens? Back in 2017, on Christmas Day, I was a teenager living with my family in a quiet suburban neighborhood. Our home wasn't particularly fancy or historic, but it was cozy, and for as long as I could remember, it had been the heart of our family gatherings. That year, we were hosting a big Christmas party, and nearly every branch of our family tree was coming to celebrate. First, second, and even some third cousins were making their way over. It had been 3 years since I'd seen many of them, so I was genuinely excited. There was a certain magic to reconnecting, laughing, and swapping stories over plates piled high with holiday food. By late morning, the house began to fill with the sound of chatter, laughter, and the clinking of dishes. People arrived between 11:30 a.m. and 1 p.m., bringing an array of dishes that quickly transformed our dining table into a feast. It was a joyful scene of warm hugs and cheerful greetings. Among the guests was my dad's cousin, Lester. He came bearing a fruit salad and an unusually cheerful demeanor. I'd never met Lester before. He lived in California, far from our East Coast town, and his absence from previous gatherings wasn't surprising. Still, there was something about him that didn't quite sit right with me. Maybe it was his slightly awkward smile, or the way he seemed overly eager to make small talk. I told myself it was just me being overly judgmental. After all, he was family. Lunch was served around 2:30, and the dining room buzzed with energy as everyone shared updates about their lives. It felt like the perfect holiday gathering, until I started noticing Lester's peculiar behavior. At first, it was subtle. He'd stare a little too long at the family photos on the walls or the antique clock in the hallway. But when he began lingering near the basement door, his odd behavior became harder to ignore. After lunch, while helping clean up, my phone vibrated. It was Elsa, my best friend. Excusing myself, I retreated to my room to chat. We talked about Christmas plans, gifts, and general life updates. It was a light, carefree conversation, but as I hung up and stretched, ready to rejoin the family, a soft knock startled me. "Come in," I called. The door creaked open, and there stood Lester. His curious eyes scanned my room before he stepped inside. "Hey there," he greeted, his tone casual but somehow unnerving. "How's school going?" I told him it was fine and shared that I was enjoying my freshman year of high school. He nodded, asking a few generic questions about my favorite classes and teachers. But then his tone shifted. "Have you ever noticed anything unusual in this house?" I frowned, caught off guard. "Unusual? Like what?" Lester tilted his head, a faint, unsettling smile on his lips. "Oh, I don't know. Sometimes old houses have their secrets." I laughed nervously. "I haven't noticed anything." He muttered under his breath before leaving. His words lingered, leaving me with a vague sense of unease. Later that evening, as the family gathered to exchange presents, I couldn't help but notice Lester again. He sat apart from the group, staring out the window with a faraway look. It wasn't the view he was admiring. It was pitch black outside, save for the faint outline of our backyard trees. When I asked if he was okay, he turned and gave me that same strange smile. "I'm fine," he replied, "just enjoying the view." By 9 p.m., most of the family had left. My parents, feeling generous, invited Lester to stay overnight, as it was late for him to drive back to his hotel. Though I didn't say anything, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling his presence gave me. That night, I lay in bed scrolling through my phone, trying to shake the strange vibe when I heard a faint creak from downstairs. Figuring it was my dad checking the doors or Lester grabbing a drink, I thought nothing of it, until I heard the basement door open. Curiosity got the better of me. I tiptoed down the hall and peeked toward the stairs. The basement light was on. Quietly, I approached and saw Lester standing in the middle of the basement, flashlight in hand, examining something on the floor. "Lester?" I called out. He jumped, quickly turning off the flashlight. "Oh, hi," he said, his voice unnaturally light. I couldn't sleep, so I thought I'd take a look around. You know, basements are fascinating. I didn't buy it. What are you looking for? He smiled nervously and brushed past me without answering. The next morning, Lester was gone. My parents said he left early to catch his flight, but something about his abrupt departure didn't sit right with me. Unable to shake my curiosity, I went down to the basement. That's when I noticed it. A floorboard near the back wall had been pried loose. Inside the gap was a small, dusty box. Opening it, I found old letters and photographs, some dating back to the 1940s. They seemed to belong to the house's previous owners. When I showed my parents, they were just as confused as I was. Why had Lester been so interested in the basement? And what had he been searching for? To this day, we don't have answers. Lester never reached out to explain, and our family hasn't seen him at any gatherings since. I often wonder, was he chasing a piece of family history, or was there something darker in his search? What do you think Lester was really looking for? Was it a connection to our family's past? Or could there be a hidden secret about the house that we're yet to uncover? Back in 2019, when I started my freshman year at Queens College in New York City, I was filled with equal parts excitement and nervousness. Coming from Chicago, the move was a big change, but I was eager to pursue my dream of studying film. As a senior now, I look back at those formative years with mixed emotions. While I made lifelong friends and unforgettable memories, there were also moments of profound discomfort that I'll never forget. Orientation day was a whirlwind of activity. I wasn't sure how I'd fit in or whether I'd find my tribe, but by the end of the day, I'd connected with a few other students who shared my passion for cinema. Among the crowd of new faces, one person stood out, not because of shared interests or good energy, but because something about him felt off. His name was Dylan. Dylan was tall and lanky, with unkempt hair and a habit of speaking too loudly. He had a penchant for obscure and often disturbing films, which he brought up in conversations no one else was having. At first, I thought he was just socially awkward. However, as the weeks went by, it became clear that his behavior went beyond that. He'd force himself into conversations, monopolize discussions with bizarre, unrelated anecdotes, and hover too close for comfort. Our small friend group tolerated Dylan's presence out of politeness, but none of us felt entirely at ease around him. Then, one evening over dinner, my friend Mary Kate shared something that sent a chill through all of us. "Did you hear about Dylan?" she asked, her voice low. "A couple of girls said he's been following them back to their dorms. They're freaked out." My stomach sank. Dylan's unsettling vibe suddenly took on a more sinister tone. Though the idea of him stalking people wasn't surprising, hearing it confirmed made it all too real. From that point forward, I avoided him as much as possible. However, Dylan had a way of inserting himself into spaces where he wasn't welcome. One afternoon, he joined our group uninvited at lunch. His usual nonsensical chatter took a darker turn when he blurted out, "Why does everyone look at me like I'm a freak? What's their problem?" I wanted to stay silent, but his intense gaze pinned me down. Finally, I snapped, "Maybe it's because you don't respect people's boundaries, Dylan. Not everything has to be about you." His face twisted with anger, and for a moment, I thought he might lash out. But he didn't say anything. He stood abruptly, his chair screeching against the floor, and stormed off. That should have been the end of it, but things escalated in ways I could never have imagined. Thanksgiving break brought a welcome reprieve. I flew back home to Chicago, looking forward to spending time with my parents and catching up on sleep. One evening, as I scrolled through my phone in my bedroom, A knock on my window shattered the tranquility. My room was on the ground floor, so the sound startled me. At first, I thought it might be a prank, but when I pulled back the curtain, my heart stopped. There, illuminated by the faint glow of the streetlights, stood Dylan. I froze, unable to process how he was there or why. Panic surged through me as I dropped the curtain and backed away. My parents were in the living room, so I bolted to tell them. "Mom, Dad, Dylan's outside my window." I blurted. "Who?" my dad asked, frowning. "A guy from school. He's been acting weird, and now he's here." My mom immediately got up. "Let's check," she said firmly. We went back to my room, but when she peeked outside, Dylan was gone. "There's no one here," she said, trying to sound calm. "Are you sure?" "He was right there," I insisted, my voice shaking. "Maybe you're just stressed," my dad said gently. "Try to get some rest." But I knew what I'd seen. For the rest of the night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, every creak of the house making my heart race. Back at school, Dylan was no longer attending classes. Rumors swirled that he'd been expelled for harassment, but no one had official confirmation. While his absence brought relief, it didn't ease my anxiety entirely. One night, while working late in the library, I felt the unmistakable sensation of being watched. As I walked back to my dorm, I glanced over my shoulder and saw a figure in the distance. My pace quickened, my pulse hammering in my ears. By the time I reached my building, I was practically running. The next day, I discovered a note taped to my dorm door. The shaky, almost childlike handwriting read, "You don't get to ignore me. We're not finished." It was signed, Dylan. Fear turned to anger. I took the note to campus security and recounted everything that had happened, from the knock at my window to the footprints in the snow. They assured me they'd investigate and advised me to stay vigilant. Eventually, Dylan seemed to vanish entirely. There were no more notes, no sightings, no eerie late-night encounters. I never learned what happened to him, but the experience left a lasting mark. It changed the way I approached my personal safety. I started double-checking locks, avoiding walking alone at night, and being cautious about what personal information I shared. What haunts me most is the question of what Dylan's endgame was. Was he simply trying to intimidate me, or did he have darker intentions? And how did he know where I lived in Chicago? Was it a coincidence, or had he been following me long before I even noticed? To this day, I wonder, how do we balance giving people the benefit of the doubt with protecting ourselves from potential danger? Have you ever ignored red flags, only to regret it later? What steps do you take to ensure your safety in seemingly ordinary situations? Let's discuss. It's a conversation worth having. They say every town has its secrets, but I never imagined I'd stumble into one during a summer job. It was 2017, and I was a senior in high school eager to earn some cash before heading off to college. The small, cozy theater near my neighborhood seemed like the perfect gig. Easy work, decent pay, and the added bonus of free movies. But I didn't realize I was stepping into something far darker than late-night horror flicks. The theater manager, Mr. Reynolds, was a tall, thin man with a face so stern it could curdle milk. His instructions were simple: clean the counters, restock the popcorn, help customers, and lock up by 2 a.m. sharp. His last rule came with an edge in his voice that made it impossible to ignore. "Lock up and leave. Don't linger after hours," he said, his dark eyes fixed on mine. No exceptions. I chalked it up to him being a stickler for rules, but the way Alexa, my coworker, flinched when he said it made me uneasy. The first month passed without much trouble. Alexa and I worked together most nights. She wasn't particularly chatty, but always rushed through her tasks like she couldn't wait to leave. "It's quieter after midnight," she once said when I asked why she seemed so jumpy on late shifts. At the time, I didn't think much of it, but things started to change during my second month. Strange, almost imperceptible details caught my attention. A faint creak in an empty theater. A shadow flickering across the screen when no one else was there. One night, as we locked up, Alexa stopped suddenly and whispered, "Do you hear that?" I strained my ears but heard only the hum of the neon sign outside. She shook her head and muttered, "Forget it," before hurrying out. Her unease rubbed off on me, but I still didn't think anything serious was happening. That all changed on a rainy Friday night. Alexa had left early, saying she didn't feel well, leaving me to close alone. I didn't mind. I liked the solitude, and it gave me time to take my tasks at my own pace. The last customers were gone by 11 p.m., and the theater was eerily silent except for the occasional patter of rain against the windows. I was wiping down the concession counter when I saw it, a shadowy figure reflected in the glass display. My heart skipped a beat. I spun around, but the lobby was empty. I tried to laugh it off, convincing myself it was just my tired eyes playing tricks. But when I went outside to take out the trash, the air felt wrong. The parking lot, dimly lit by flickering streetlights, stretched out like an empty stage. I was halfway to the dumpster when I heard footsteps behind me. My blood turned cold. I stopped, and so did the footsteps. Slowly, I turned around. At first, there was nothing, but then I saw movement, a shadow darting behind the theater wall. I dropped the trash bag and sprinted back inside, locking the door behind me. Through the glass doors, I saw him, a tall figure, face obscured by a plain white mask. He stood motionless, watching me. My hands trembled as I fumbled for my phone, but before I could call anyone, he disappeared into the darkness. The next morning, I confronted Mr. Reynolds. To my shock, he didn't seem surprised by my story. "You probably imagined it," he said coldly. When I pushed back, he gave me a hard stare. "Focus on your work. That's all you need to worry about." That night, Alexa admitted she'd seen strange things too. "It's why I never stay late," she confessed. She told me about a former employee who had been fired years ago. "They say he was obsessed with the late-night screenings," she said. "One night, he snapped. He attacked someone with a knife, wearing a mask to hide his identity. They arrested him, but," her voice trailed off, "some people think his spirit never left." I tried to brush it off as superstition, but a part of me couldn't shake the unease. The next Saturday, Alexa called in sick again. Determined to finish early, I worked quickly, but the theater felt alive that night. Every sound seemed amplified: the creak of floorboards, the hum of the projector. While cleaning the last theater, the lights flickered and went out. My phone's flashlight barely cut through the suffocating darkness. Then I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming closer. I shined my light toward the back of the theater and froze. The masked figure was there, head tilted at an unnatural angle. I dropped the flashlight and ran, my heart pounding as I burst into the lobby. The projector in theater 1 flickered to life, casting distorted images onto the screen. To my horror, it was footage of me, cleaning the lobby earlier that night. The timestamp was from minutes ago. Suddenly, the image changed. It showed me standing in the theater, and behind me was the masked figure, so close I could almost feel his breath. A voice whispered behind me, "You're late." I screamed and bolted for the emergency exit. It wouldn't budge. "Time's up," the voice hissed. With one final push, I forced the door open and stumbled into the parking lot, running as fast as I could into the rain-soaked night. I quit the next morning, ignoring Mr. Reynolds' calls. When Alexa asked what happened, I couldn't bring myself to explain. Rumors spread about mysterious accidents and employees who vanished during their shifts. To this day, I don't know if what I saw was a ghost, a deranged stalker, or something worse. But I do know one thing. I'll never set foot in a theater again. What do you think was haunting the theater? Was it truly the ghost of the former employee? Or could Mr. Reynolds have been hiding a darker secret? Would you have stayed at a job with such strange rules and eerie incidents? It's funny how life can change in an instant, how an ordinary night can spiral into something you'll remember forever. For me, that night was a cold November evening in 2019. One of those crisp nights where the chill seeps into your bones, and the only remedy is to huddle under a warm blanket with a hot drink. I lived alone in a cozy house on the edge of the woods. It was quiet and serene, a haven away from the chaos of the city. My only companion was Rocky, my loyal German shepherd, with his sharp black markings and a tail that wagged like a flag on a breezy day. Rocky wasn't just my pet. He was family. Sweet, loving, and fiercely protective. He had a knack for making me feel safe even in the solitude of my little home. But that night, He proved he was more than just a companion. He became my hero. It all started as a regular evening. I had just finished dinner, curled up on the couch with a blanket, sipping on a cup of tea. Rocky lay sprawled near the door, his head resting on his paws, his half-lidded eyes following me as I scrolled mindlessly through my phone. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the windows and making the old house creak. It was the kind of sound you could easily write off as just the house settling, but something about it felt louder, sharper. I stood up, stretching, ready to head to bed. As I moved to turn off the lights, Rocky's demeanor shifted. His ears perked up, his body tensed, and his deep brown eyes locked onto the front door. A low growl rumbled from his chest, a sound I had rarely heard from him before. "What's wrong, boy?" I asked, my voice more tentative than I'd have liked. He didn't respond, obviously, but his behavior spoke volumes. He stood and inched closer to the door, his growl growing louder, more urgent. My pulse quickened. I told myself it was probably nothing, a deer, maybe, or a raccoon, but Rocky wasn't one to overreact. Peeking out through the curtain, I scanned the yard. The pale moonlight spilled over the trees, their shadows swaying eerily in the wind. Nothing seemed out of place. Letting out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding, I turned back to Rocky. "See? There's nothing." Before I could finish, he erupted into a frenzy of barking, throwing his full weight against the door. My stomach twisted in fear. Rocky wasn't wrong. Something, or someone, was out there. My heart hammered as I strained to hear, and then I caught it. The faint crunch of footsteps on the gravel outside. I grabbed my phone, my hands trembling as I dialed 911. The dispatcher's calm voice was a stark contrast to the panic racing through me. "Stay on the line," she instructed. "Officers are on their way. Stay calm and lock yourself inside." Rocky's barking grew fiercer, his body a solid barrier against the door. And then it happened. A loud, violent bang. The door shook as if someone had thrown their full weight against it. My blood turned ice cold. "Get away from the door," I shouted, backing up as I frantically scanned for something, anything, to defend myself. My eyes landed on the fireplace poker. Grabbing it, I clutched it tightly, my knuckles white. The door splintered, the lock giving way under the pressure. In one deafening crash, it flew open, revealing a man in a mask, his frame broad and intimidating. He hesitated for a split second, but that was all Rocky needed. With a snarl that sent shivers down my spine, Rocky lunged. The man stumbled back, his arms flailing as Rocky sank his teeth into his forearm. The sound of his screams was raw and guttural, filling the air as Rocky held firm, shaking his head violently. Blood splattered the floor, and for a moment, I was frozen, too terrified to move. "Get out!" I screamed, finally finding my voice. The man wrestled free, shoving Rocky off, but not without leaving a piece of his shredded sleeve and skin behind. He bolted, clutching his arm, disappearing into the woods as Rocky chased him to the edge of the yard, barking furiously. I collapsed onto the floor, my legs giving out beneath me. Rocky trotted back, panting, his tail wagging as if he hadn't just saved my life. I wrapped my arms around him, tears streaming down my face. "Good boy," I whispered over and over, my voice cracking. "You're such a good boy." The police arrived minutes later. They examined the door, took my statement, and called Rocky a hero. The officer explained that the intruder had likely been casing the house for weeks, waiting for the right moment. The thought sent a fresh wave of chills down my spine. The rest of the night passed in a blur of adrenaline and unease. I didn't sleep. Instead, I sat on the couch with Rocky, replaying the events over and over in my mind. What if I hadn't listened to Rocky? What if I'd gone to bed, dismissing his growls as nothing? The next day, a locksmith came to replace the door and reinforce the locks. I installed security cameras and motion sensor lights around the property. But even with these precautions, the fear lingered. Every creak of the house, every rustle of the wind, made my heart race. Rocky, on the other hand, seemed unfazed. He lay by the fireplace, his eyes following me as if to say, "I've got you." And he did. He wasn't just my pet anymore. He was my guardian, my protector, my hero. To this day, I can't pass that new door without thinking of that night. What would have happened if Rocky hadn't been there? Would I have been able to fend off the intruder alone? It's a haunting thought. What do you think? Was Rocky acting on instinct, or was there something deeper at play? A connection? An unspoken understanding between us that made him act so fiercely that night?